In 2022, the United States printed more money in 2 years than it had in the previous 2 centuries combined. Not an exaggeration, not a metaphor. $5 trillion created, just like that. And yet, when Zimbabwe tried something similar in 2008, their currency became so worthless that people used $100 trillion bills as toilet paper. Literally. So what's the difference? Why can America flood the world with freshly printed dollars while other countries turn into economic graveyards when they try the same thing? The answer isn't what most people think. There's a financial superpower that only one country on Earth actually possesses, and it's not about military strength or natural resources or even the size of the economy. It's about trust, but not the kind you're imagining. When the U.S. Federal Reserve creates new dollars, something strange happens. The world doesn't panic. They don't dump American currency. They don't run to gold or Bitcoin or Chinese yuan. They do the opposite. They buy more dollars. During the 2020 pandemic, when the Fed announced it would print trillions to stabilize markets, what happened? The dollar strengthened against most other currencies. It made no logical sense. Print more of something and it should be worth less, right? But the dollar isn't logical, it's structural. And that structure was built 79 years ago in a hotel in New Hampshire. July 44. World War II is still raging, but 44 nations sent delegates to a place called Bretton Woods to answer one question: what happens to money after the war ends? Europe is destroyed, Japan is in ruins, the British Empire is bankrupt. In America? Untouched, wealthy, holding most of the world's gold. So they made a deal. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. The U.S. would be the center. Everyone else would orbit around it. It was supposed to be temporary. It lasted 27 years. Then, in 1971, Richard Nixon did something unprecedented. He closed the gold window, meaning the dollar was no longer backed by anything physical. It became what economists call fiat currency. Its value came from belief, from trust, from the fact that everyone agreed it had value. Most countries would have collapsed at that moment, but something unexpected happened instead. The dollar became more powerful. Because by then, the entire global system had been built around it. Oil was priced in dollars, international debts were issued in dollars, central banks held their reserves in dollars. The infrastructure was already there. Ripping it out would have been like removing the foundation from under a skyscraper while people still lived inside. So the world kept using dollars, not because they loved America, because switching costs were too high. And that's where the printing press comes in. Here's the part that breaks most people's brains. When the U.S. prints money, it's not just creating cash for Americans, it's creating the medium of exchange for the entire planet. Think about it. If you're a business in Brazil buying oil from Saudi Arabia, you don't pay in Brazilian reals or Saudi reals, you pay in dollars. If you're a government in Kenya trying to pay off debt to investors in Europe, you pay in dollars. 70 countries peg their currency directly to the dollar. 88% of all foreign exchange transactions involve dollars. About 60% of global central bank reserves are held in dollars. This creates something economists call exorbitant privilege. The U.S. can borrow cheaply because everyone needs dollars. It can run massive deficits because the world is willing to finance them. It can print trillions because there's a bottomless global demand for those trillions. When Zimbabwe printed money, there was no one outside Zimbabwe who needed Zimbabwean dollars for anything. When Argentina prints pesos, the rest of the world doesn't care. The currency dilutes locally and collapses. But when America prints dollars, that money spreads across 200 countries and territories. The dilution is global. The pain is distributed. The inflation gets exported. It's not a bug. It's the design. And most countries can't do anything about it because their own economies are denominated in the very currency being printed. Here's where it gets darker. Every time the Federal Reserve creates new dollars, someone pays for it, but it's not always obvious who. After 2008, the Fed printed $4 trillion through quantitative easing. After 2020, another $5 trillion. Officially, this was to prevent financial collapse and stimulate the economy, and it worked, sort of. Stock markets soared, real estate values exploded, billionaires became richer at almost any point in history. But wages barely moved. The price of groceries, rent, healthcare, education kept climbing. Because new money doesn't enter the economy evenly. It goes to banks first, to asset holders, to people who already own things. By the time it trickles down to regular workers, prices have already adjusted. You're not richer, you're just holding more dollars that buy less. But the real victims aren't even in the US. Developing countries that borrowed in dollars suddenly find their debt harder to repay as their own currencies weaken. Import costs spike because dollars are more expensive. Inflation surges. In 2022, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, Egypt, and Ghana all faced currency crises, not because they mismanaged their economies more than usual, because the Fed raised interest rates and strengthened the dollar, making their dollar-denominated debts unbearable. The ripple effect is invisible to most Americans, but it's devastating elsewhere. And the thing is, no one votes on this. There's no international council that decides whether the Fed should print money. The U.S. makes monetary policy for domestic reasons, and the rest of the world just has to absorb the consequences. It's the most powerful economic tool in the world, and it's wielded by a committee of 12 people in Washington, D.C., who aren't elected by anyone outside the United States. So if this system is so powerful, why does anyone think it could end? Because exorbitant privilege only works as long as the world believes it has no alternative. And lately, cracks are forming. China has been signing bilateral trade deals that bypass the dollar entirely. Saudi Arabia, the country that made oil and dollars inseparable, has started discussing oil sales in yuan. Russia got cut off from dollar-based payment systems after invading Ukraine, and instead of collapsing, found workarounds. The weaponization of the dollar through sanctions showed everyone that access to the system isn't guaranteed. If the U.S. can freeze your reserves or cut you off from SWIFT, suddenly holding all your savings in dollars feels less like safety and more like hostage-taking. Meanwhile, the U.S. itself keeps adding to the national debt, $35 trillion and counting. At some point, even the most privileged borrower looks risky. The question isn't whether the dollar will lose its dominance overnight. It won't. The question is whether it erodes slowly. A percentage point here, a trade deal there, a few countries diversifying their reserves. Death by 1,000 cuts. And if that happens, the printing press stops being a superpower. It becomes a liability. So why can the U.S. print trillions without collapsing? Because it built a system where the entire world needs dollars more than America needs the world. But systems like that don't last forever. They last until someone builds a better one, or until the current one becomes too expensive to maintain. We're living in the middle of that tension right now. America still has the printer, but more countries are starting to ask why they're still buying the ink. And once that question gets asked enough times, the answer might not be the one America wants to hear. The dollar's dominance isn't guaranteed by economics, it's guaranteed by momentum. And momentum, eventually, runs out.